In the later years of life, what hurts more, being openly betrayed, or slowly realizing that the people you trusted most no longer respect you anymore? Is it the wound itself that stays with you, or the quiet understanding that your voice no longer carries the weight it once did? Because there comes a moment, usually without warning, when you realize you're being spoken around instead of spoken to, and that realization doesn't shout. It settles, it lingers, and it follows you long after the room goes silent. For a long time, nothing feels wrong enough to name. Life hasn't collapsed. There's no argument to point to, no raised voices, no obvious cruelty. Days still pass, routines still hold, and from the outside, everything appears calm. Familiar, even. Trust still sits where it always has, or at least it feels like it should. There's an unspoken belief that the people closest will naturally protect not just comfort, but dignity. That respect doesn't need reminders, because it was earned over decades of showing up, sacrificing, and putting family first without keeping score. And maybe that's why the first unease is so easy to dismiss. It doesn't arrive as conflict. It arrives as a tone shift, a pause before answering a question, a decision mentioned casually, already settled, as if approval had been given earlier, even though it hadn't. At the time, it feels easier to assume good intentions than to question them. Easier to stay quiet than to risk sounding ungrateful. After all, silence has always kept the peace, without realizing that decisions were already being made without me. But when silence keeps the peace for everyone else, who does it protect you from? Because silence changes meaning with age. What once felt like patience slowly begins to look like absence. And absence, to the wrong people, starts to feel like permission. There's a subtle shift that happens, not in how much you care, but in how much you're consulted. Explanations become shorter. Decisions arrive already wrapped up. Reassurance replaces discussion. And each time it happens, it feels small enough to forgive, small enough to ignore, until the pattern becomes harder to deny. There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from being overlooked. From realizing that the same hands you once guided now gently move decisions past you, explaining less, asking less, assuming more. Not because they mean harm, at least not openly, but because somewhere along the way, they decided it was simpler this way. Simpler not to explain, simpler not to involve, simpler not to ask. And that's when the questions begin, not out loud, but inside. When did my opinion become optional? When did concern replace respect? When did care start sounding like control? You replay conversations in your head, searching for the moment you missed, wondering if you misunderstood, wondering if this is just how things are supposed to be now. Because silence doesn't stay neutral forever. There's a quiet fear that comes with those thoughts. Not fear of confrontation, but fear of being dismissed, of being told you're overreacting or imagining things or forgetting details. Fear that if you speak too firmly, the concern in their voices will sharpen into something else entirely. And that's when a thought appears, brief, unsettling, impossible to ignore. The first moment, I wondered what might already be happening without me knowing. So you wait. You listen more carefully. You begin choosing your words with caution, measuring tone, timing, even facial expressions, as if respect has become something fragile that might break if handled the wrong way. You notice how often reassurance replaces answers, how often calm is used to end conversations instead of resolve them. Looking back, it becomes clear that the beginning isn't loud enough to alarm anyone else. Friends wouldn't notice it. Neighbors wouldn't see it. Even family might deny it if asked directly. But it's loud enough to change something inside. Because once you sense that respect is fading, you never quite relax again. You start noticing details you never paid attention to before. Who answers questions for you? Who interrupts? Who reassures instead of listens? And once that distance forms, it doesn't ask permission before it starts deciding things for you. Even then, part of you still hopes you're wrong. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting something far more painful than betrayal itself. That the people you trusted most may have decided your silence meant you no longer needed to be included. That your years of sacrifice are remembered, but no longer consulted. That your presence is valued, but your participation is optional. You begin noticing how often decisions are justified after the fact. How explanations come packaged with reassurance, as if comfort matters more than consent. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin adjusting yourself, speaking less, asking less, pushing concerns aside before they ever reach your lips. Not because you don't care, but because caring now feels risky. Because when people assume you won't push back, they stop checking where the line is. And that realization doesn't arrive all at once. It settles slowly, quietly. It shows up in moments you replay later, wondering why they felt heavier than they should have. It lingers in conversations that ended too quickly. It follows you into silence that no longer feels peaceful. And once it settles, it changes how you listen, how you wait, how you trust. Because deep down, you begin to understand something unsettling. The story isn't about what has already happened. It's about what could happen next if nothing changes. And whether silence, chosen for dignity and peace, might soon be mistaken for something far more dangerous. For most of life, giving never felt like sacrifice. It was simply how love worked. You showed up because you were needed. You stayed late, worked longer, gave more, not because anyone demanded it, but because responsibility felt natural. Family came first, not as a slogan, but as a quiet rule lived by without discussion. There was pride in that kind of life. Not the loud kind, not something you spoke about, but the steady pride that settles in after years of doing what needed to be done without keeping score. Support was offered freely. Advice was given only when asked. Boundaries were understood without explanation. Decisions were discussed, not dictated. And even when life became difficult, financially, emotionally, physically, there was comfort in knowing you had earned a place at the table. Not just a seat, but a voice. That kind of trust doesn't come from authority. It comes from history. Looking back now, that history explains why the shift was so dangerous. Because people who have always given don't expect to be excluded. They don't guard their independence aggressively. They assume respect is permanent because it always has been. And that assumption, quiet, reasonable, human, is exactly what made the change harder to recognize. Because no one prepares you for the moment when years of sacrifice start being treated like something already spent. At first, nothing obvious was taken. There were no demands, no ultimatums. Just a growing tendency for others to step in where you once stood comfortably. Help was offered before it was requested. Opinions were softened with phrases like, "You don't need to worry about that anymore." It sounded considerate. It felt caring. And for a while, it was easy to accept, especially when strength wasn't what it used to be. But slowly, help began arriving with assumptions attached. That you'd agree, that you wouldn't object, that you wouldn't need details. Conversations shortened. Explanations became summaries. And somewhere in those adjustments, a line was crossed so quietly it almost didn't register. The first time something important was decided without you, based on the belief that you'd be fine with it. There was no confrontation afterward, no correction. You told yourself it wasn't worth making things uncomfortable, that harmony mattered more, that this was just part of growing older, letting others take on responsibility. But beneath that reasoning, a question began to form, unsettling and persistent. When did support turn into substitution? Because giving up control voluntarily is one thing. Losing it without being asked is another. Sacrifice has a strange side effect. It teaches others what they can rely on, and sometimes what they can take for granted. Years of reliability quietly become expectation. Years of strength become proof that you'll adapt. And the more you've given without complaint, the easier it becomes for others to assume you won't start now. That realization didn't arrive dramatically. It came in a moment so small it almost didn't matter. Almost. A comment said lightly. A plan explained too briefly. A reassurance offered where a question should have been asked. And in that moment came a quiet alarm. The first thought that maybe this wasn't about helping anymore, but about efficiency. Efficiency doesn't ask how you feel. It asks what's easiest. And once ease becomes the priority, respect often becomes optional. You began to notice how often your past sacrifices were referenced, not with gratitude, but as justification. You've done so much already. You deserve to rest. Let us handle this now. The words sounded kind, but they carried an unspoken message. Your role was changing, and you weren't being consulted about the terms. The sacrifices that once earned respect now justified replacement. And once your role changes without your consent, it rarely changes back on its own. There's a strange guilt that comes with being needed for so long. You don't want to seem ungrateful when others step in, or controlling by asking questions. You worry that asserting yourself might look like refusal, not of help, but of reality itself. And so you begin editing yourself, shortening objections, softening concerns, choosing comfort over clarity. Looking back, this is where the imbalance deepened. Not because others suddenly became cruel, but because silence made room for assumption. The sacrifices that once built stability now seemed to justify exclusion. And without realizing it, you began negotiating for involvement in a life you had built from the ground up. The truth is, nothing is taken all at once. Independence doesn't disappear overnight. It fades through convenience, through help, through decisions made in your absence that slowly redefine your place. Because when people stop asking, it's usually because they've already decided. Even then, part of you still believed things would correct themselves, that this was temporary, that your voice would naturally return once things settled. But something had shifted, not just in behavior, but in expectation. And expectations, once reset, are rarely volunteered back. What made it hardest was this. You had earned trust through a lifetime of sacrifice, and now that same history was being used to explain why you no longer needed to be involved. And in that contradiction sat the first real danger. Not loss, not conflict, but the quiet realization that waiting, this time, might cost more than speaking ever would, because some decisions, once made, don't ask twice. The first time the truth surfaced, it didn't arrive as suspicion, it arrived as confirmation. A detail mentioned too casually, a decision already finalized, something that should have required a conversation, delivered instead as information. Not, what do you think? But, this has already been taken care of. And in that moment, it became painfully clear that what had been feared in silence had already moved ahead without permission. There was no warning, no gradual transition, just the sudden understanding that something important had already been decided, documented, and set in motion, quietly, efficiently, and without resistance. Papers had been signed, not angrily, not secretly, but confidently, under the assumption that no objection would follow. The room didn't feel tense. Voices stayed calm. Smiles didn't falter. And that was what made it worse. Because it meant this wasn't accidental. It wasn't rushed. It had been planned under the belief that disagreement either wouldn't come or wouldn't matter. The shock wasn't loud. It was physical. A tightening in the chest. A pause that lasted half a second too long before responding. And in that pause came the realization that this wasn't the beginning of loss. It was the moment the loss became visible. Because betrayal doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it informs you after it's already done. At first, the mind reached for explanations. Maybe there was a misunderstanding. Maybe the wording had been careless. Maybe this could still be discussed. You replayed the sentence again, listening for an opening that would suggest flexibility. But every clarification that followed only confirmed the same truth. The decision wasn't provisional. It was settled. Arrangements had been made. Details handled. And when the question finally came, why wasn't I included? The answer arrived wrapped in reassurance instead of reason. We didn't want to worry you. This was simpler. It's better this way. Better for whom was never addressed. That was the moment doubt stopped being internal and became external. Because once something is signed, moved, or authorized without you, silence no longer feels like patience. It feels like exposure. And the most unsettling part wasn't what had been done, but how easily it was explained away, as if the impact on your life was secondary to how smoothly it had been handled. Because once someone decides on your behalf, they're already practicing doing it again. Fear doesn't always feel like panic. Sometimes it feels like clarity arriving too late. You began retracing recent weeks, replaying conversations with new understanding. The shortened explanations, the sudden helpfulness, the way questions were answered before they were fully asked. What once felt like support now revealed its true function: preparation. And with that realization came a quieter, more dangerous thought. If this much had already been decided without you, what else already had been? That question didn't demand proof. It didn't need it. The pattern was suddenly visible. And patterns don't require imagination, only recognition. You noticed how quickly topics shifted when details were requested. How reassurance arrived faster than answers. How calm was offered where clarity should have been. And calm, you were beginning to understand, wasn't there to comfort. It was there to end the conversation. Because when calm is used to end questions, it's no longer kindness, it's control. The most frightening part wasn't the decision itself. It was how little resistance it had encountered. No hesitation. No checking. No moment of pause to consider whether permission was required. And that meant something worse than disagreement. It meant authority over your own life had already been quietly downgraded. You could hear it in how people spoke afterward. Slower. Softer. As if the decision itself had redefined how capable you were allowed to appear. And once that shift happens, objection no longer sounds like disagreement. It sounds like confusion, like denial, like something that needs to be managed. This was the danger no one warns you about. Not loss of comfort, not loss of assets, but loss of credibility over your own life. And in that moment, one thing became painfully clear. Reacting emotionally now would only confirm the assumptions that made this possible. Anger would be labeled instability. Questions would be framed as confusion. Protest would be used as evidence that the decision had been necessary. So you did the only thing left. You stayed quiet. Because sometimes silence isn't chosen for peace. It's chosen for survival. That silence wasn't agreement. It wasn't acceptance. It was containment. You needed time, not to forgive, but to understand how far this had already gone. How many doors had been closed without your knowledge? How many permissions had been assumed? How many future decisions were now easier because this one had succeeded? You began listening differently, not as a participant, but as an observer. Every word mattered now. Every assumption revealed something. You paid attention to what was explained and what wasn't, to what required reassurance and what was presented as non-negotiable. Because one thing was now unmistakably clear. The line hadn't just been approached. It had been crossed. And once crossed, it doesn't reset itself. The danger wasn't coming. It was already here. After that moment, nothing looked different. And that was the most unsettling part. The house didn't change. The routines didn't change. Voices stayed calm. Schedules stayed orderly. And concern continued to be expressed with practiced ease. From the outside, everything appeared stable, reasonable, controlled. But inside, something had fractured, and once fractured, it refused to settle back into place. Every thought now carried a second voice. Not disagreement, doubt. You replayed conversations repeatedly, searching for clarity, but each time, they ended the same way. With uncertainty. With questions that no longer felt safe to ask out loud. You began wondering whether the shock you felt had exaggerated the situation. Whether fear had distorted your perception. Whether you were reacting emotionally to something that truly was for the best. That's how collapse begins. Not with chaos, but with hesitation. Because the most dangerous thing you can lose isn't control, it's certainty. The explanations continued, always gentle, always reasonable. Each time you hesitated, reassurance arrived quickly. You're overthinking. This is normal. You've done enough, let us handle it now. None of it sounded cruel. That was the problem. The words were chosen carefully, designed to soothe rather than clarify. And when reassurance replaces answers long enough, you begin to question whether answers were ever necessary. You noticed how concern followed resistance. If you pushed slightly, voices softened further. Questions about your stress, your memory, your rest. Suggestions disguised as care. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. Disagreement wasn't evidence of clarity, it was a symptom. And once that implication takes hold, self-trust becomes fragile. You started weighing every thought before speaking. Not because it lacked merit, but because you feared how it would be interpreted. Would this sound confused? Defensive? Emotional? You rehearsed sentences internally, then discarded them before they ever reached your lips. Silence became a form of self-protection, even as it deepened the isolation. Because once your doubt benefits someone else, it stops being accidental. What made it harder was how familiar everything still felt. The same rooms, the same people, the same routines. That familiarity was used as proof that nothing significant had changed. See, everything is fine. And part of you wanted to believe it, because believing it would mean the unease was imagined, not earned. But the body doesn't lie the way words do. You felt it in the tension before conversations, in the careful listening, in the way your attention sharpened, not out of curiosity, but vigilance. You weren't participating anymore. You were monitoring. And people don't monitor environments where they feel safe. You began noticing contradictions. How decisions were framed as temporary, but never revisited. How explanations shifted slightly each time they were repeated. How your questions were answered differently, depending on who was present. None of it was blatant enough to confront, and that was intentional. Ambiguity became the shield. Because gaslighting doesn't need lies, it only needs inconsistency. There was a growing sense of disorientation. Not confusion, but something colder. A feeling that the ground beneath your understanding was shifting just enough to keep you off balance. You started remembering exact phrases, tracking details, holding onto timelines, not to accuse anyone, but to reassure yourself that your perception was still intact. And somewhere beneath the doubt, something else began to form, not certainty, but awareness. Awareness that this wasn't random. Awareness that the confusion had a direction. You noticed how often your past sacrifices were referenced. How the very history that should have earned respect was now being used to explain why you no longer needed to be involved. You've done enough. Let us take over. The words sounded like gratitude, but they functioned like dismissal. You weren't being excluded loudly. You were being retired quietly. Because being thanked while being erased is still erasure. And once you recognize that, you also recognize that this can't continue unchanged. The collapse wasn't happening all at once. It was happening in layers. Confidence thinning, certainty weakening, authority softening. Each layer peeled away with care, not force. And that made it harder to resist, because resistance now felt like disruption rather than defense. The most frightening part wasn't that others were questioning you. It was that you had started doing it yourself. You caught it in small moments, second-guessing instincts that had guided you for decades, deferring automatically, accepting explanations that didn't quite make sense, simply because challenging them felt exhausting. And exhaustion is a powerful tool. When people are tired, they stop pushing. They stop clarifying. They start surviving. But once the cost became clear, silence stopped feeling neutral. It began to feel like participation, not agreement, but allowance. And that realization, quiet as it was, carried intent with it. Not action yet, not confrontation, but the understanding that this could not remain exactly as it was. The first real consequence didn't arrive dramatically. It showed up disguised as convenience. An appointment rescheduled without being mentioned. A bill already paid before it was discussed. A form filled out and signed to save time. Each thing, on its own, felt small enough to accept. Helpful even. But together, they formed something heavier. A quiet pattern where participation was no longer required. At first, you told yourself this was practical. That this was what support looked like now. You reminded yourself that strength changes with age, that roles evolve, that letting others handle details didn't mean losing ownership. But then came the moment that made it impossible to ignore. The moment when something you relied on daily was altered without warning, and you weren't informed until after it was done, and you realized this couldn't simply be undone. It wasn't symbolic. It was functional, and it affected how you lived. Because once your daily life changes without your consent, the situation is no longer theoretical. You noticed it in the way access was framed. This is easier. This will help you. You don't need to worry about this anymore. Language shifted subtly, from collaboration to instruction, from discussion to notification. And the more often it happened, the clearer it became that these weren't temporary adjustments. They were replacements. Finances were the next to change. Not taken outright. Not stolen. Simplified. Consolidated. Handled. Words chosen carefully to sound responsible rather than restrictive. You were still included, but only in summary. Numbers were explained after decisions were made. Questions were answered vaguely, with reassurance replacing transparency. And when you pressed for detail, the response wasn't anger, it was concern. That concern carried weight, because concern implied fragility. And fragility, once suggested, becomes justification. Because once your capability is questioned, control stops needing permission. You began to notice how often access was mediated. Passwords kept safe for you. Documents stored securely. Information passed along when necessary, according to someone else's definition of necessary. Nothing was locked away explicitly. It was simply no longer handed to you directly. The most unsettling part wasn't that things were being managed. It was that they were being managed successfully. No obvious mistakes. No visible chaos. Which made it harder to object without sounding ungrateful or paranoid. And that effectiveness became its own trap. Because when control appears smooth, resistance starts to look unreasonable. Daily routines adjusted next. Small changes at first. Suggestions that became expectations. Expectations that became defaults. You noticed how often you were informed instead of consulted. how often decisions were presented as done favors rather than shared choices. And each time you adjusted, the adjustment became the new normal. Because the most permanent losses are the ones you adapt to, and adaptation doesn't stop loss, it trains it. There was a quiet grief in realizing that independence doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes through accommodation, through choosing not to push back, through telling yourself it's not worth the tension. But the body remembers, the mind remembers, and eventually, the absence of choice begins to feel heavier than the inconvenience of conflict. You began to feel it physically, not pain, but restriction, a narrowing of options, a sense that certain decisions were no longer yours to initiate. You waited for permission you had never needed before, asked questions you once answered yourself. And each time you did, something inside tightened. This wasn't about pride. It was about agency, about the right to decide the rhythm of your own life. And that right, once compromised, doesn't announce itself loudly. It simply stops showing up when you reach for it. Because when permission replaces choice, dignity is already at risk. The most dangerous realization came slowly, not all at once. You understood that if this continued unchecked, the next decisions would be easier to make without you than with you. That precedent had been established, and precedent, once set, gathers speed. You saw it in how conversations changed, how explanations grew shorter, how reassurance was used to smooth over discomfort instead of address it. And you recognized the pattern clearly now, not help, not support, but control justified by concern. By the end of it, the consequences were undeniable, not because something had been taken loudly, but because so much had been quietly redirected. Time, choice, authority, and standing there, living within boundaries you hadn't drawn, one truth became unavoidable. Silence hadn't preserved your independence. It had made its removal easier. And once that became clear, the situation could no longer be endured passively, because the cost was no longer abstract. It was being lived. Once the cost became clear, something inside shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly, but decisively. The fear that once scattered thoughts now sharpened them. The doubt that had eroded confidence gave way to something steadier. Awareness. You stopped asking whether this was happening and began asking how it was happening and how far it had already gone. Nothing changed on the surface. Voices stayed calm. Routine stayed intact. Gratitude was still offered when expected. But the posture beneath it all was different now. Silence was no longer avoidance. It was intentional, chosen, because reacting too soon wouldn't stop anything. It would only confirm the narrative already forming around you. So you waited, not passively, attentively, because once you understand the pattern, impatience becomes the real risk. You began listening differently, not for reassurance, but for assumption, not for kindness, but for certainty. Every statement revealed more than it intended. What was explained carefully mattered less than what was said casually. You paid attention to phrasing, to tone, to what no longer required explanation. Slowly, a map began to form, not of events, but of beliefs. Who assumed authority? Who expected compliance? Who believed resistance was no longer possible? You noticed how often decisions were framed as already complete, how frequently words like handled, taken care of, and sorted out appeared, language that closed doors rather than opened them. None of it was accidental. And once seen clearly, it could no longer be unseen. This wasn't preparation fueled by anger. It was preparation grounded in restraint. Because anger would have narrowed focus, restraint widened it. Because the people who feel most secure are often the ones exposing themselves. You began asking questions, not directly, not all at once, but selectively. Questions that sounded casual, curious, supportive, the kind that didn't raise defenses. And in answering them, people revealed more than they realized. Details emerged, timelines clarified, assumptions surfaced, confidence filled the gaps where caution should have been. At the same time, you began rebuilding something that had been quietly weakened, your own internal reference point. You trusted your memory again, your instincts, your ability to recognize patterns. The fog lifted slowly, replaced not with certainty, but coherence. Things made sense now, not morally, procedurally. And that distinction mattered. Because once you stop asking whether it's wrong and start asking how it works, clarity accelerates. You started organizing information mentally, not collecting evidence yet, just understanding structure. What decisions required signatures? What didn't? Who spoke for whom? Who deferred automatically? You noticed how often authority traveled through convenience rather than legitimacy. And that awareness created leverage, not the kind used immediately, but the kind held patiently. And then came another realization, quieter, but heavier, that the longer this went unnoticed, the harder it would be to undo. That delay didn't preserve balance, it hardened it. That understanding didn't cause panic. It caused precision. You resisted the urge to correct misunderstandings, to reassert yourself prematurely, to prove capability. That urge was natural and dangerous, because correcting too early would only teach others where resistance lived. Better to let assumptions stand. Better to let confidence overextend. Patience, you understood now, wasn't surrender. It was positioning. Because when people believe control is complete, they stop protecting it. The final stage of preparation wasn't external. It was internal alignment. You accepted something difficult but freeing. That not everything could be restored immediately. That the goal wasn't confrontation, but correction. Not punishment, but balance. That meant choosing timing over emotion. Accuracy over volume. You stopped waiting for acknowledgement. Stopped hoping for voluntary reversal. Those hopes had kept you still. Releasing them made movement possible. And in that stillness, deliberate, informed, watchful, something important returned. Not power, not authority, composure. The kind that comes from knowing you're no longer reacting to events, but tracking them. You hadn't acted yet. You hadn't revealed anything yet, but you were no longer unprepared. And awareness, once regained, doesn't disappear again. It waits, and it notices everything. The first crack didn't look like failure. It looked like hesitation, a pause where confidence used to be immediate, a sentence restarted halfway through, a reassurance offered too quickly, as if it were needed more by the speaker than by you. Nothing overt, nothing dramatic. But once you noticed it, you couldn't stop noticing it. Because control has a sound when it's comfortable, and a different one when it's not. Nothing had been challenged openly. No objections raised. No demands made. And yet, the rhythm had shifted. Decisions were still happening, but they were being explained a little more carefully now. Details that had once been skipped were suddenly included. Not because you asked, but because someone felt the need to justify them. That need was new. Because when confidence starts explaining itself, it's already under pressure. You noticed it in the timing. Conversations that used to happen without you were now mentioned afterward. Casually, almost accidentally. Not to invite input, but to prevent surprise. The difference was subtle, but meaningful. Information was no longer withheld by default. It was being released strategically. You didn't respond differently. That was important. You listened. You acknowledged. You let explanations stand on their own. And in doing so, you gave them room to stretch, and sometimes, to contradict themselves. That's how cracks widen. Not through force, but through weight. There were small inconsistencies now. Nothing provable. Just moments where explanations didn't line up perfectly with earlier versions. Where timelines shifted slightly. Where responsibility was redirected mid-sentence. Each one alone meant nothing. Together, they meant recalibration. Because when people start adjusting their story, it's usually because they sense an audience. You noticed how often reassurance returned, unprompted. We're just trying to help. Everything's fine. This is all for your benefit. The repetition wasn't for you. It was for them. Reassurance, repeated often enough, becomes a defense. Tone changed next. Slightly. Less instructive. More careful. Requests framed as suggestions again. Permissions hinted at rather than assumed. It wasn't respect yet, but it was caution. And caution only appears when someone senses risk. Because once people realize they're being observed, they don't just edit themselves, they start slipping. Impatience surfaced soon after. Not directed at you, but leaking sideways. Shorter tempers elsewhere. Sharper reactions when plans were questioned by others. Pressure had redistributed. When control tightens in one place, it loosens in another. Then came the mistakes. Small ones. Careless ones. A document referenced too early. A comment made before context was agreed upon. A detail mentioned that contradicted a previous explanation. They weren't confessions. They were lapses. And mistakes don't stay small once someone else starts noticing them. It wasn't fear driving this. It was overconfidence beginning to fracture. Because when people think they've already won, they stop checking their footing. You remained steady. That steadiness mattered more now than ever. You didn't seize on inconsistencies. didn't correct timelines, didn't press advantage. Pressure works best when it isn't announced. Letting others speak freely was doing more damage than any argument could. You could feel the shift clearly now, not in words, but in posture. The way conversations slowed when you entered a room. The way decisions were now referenced instead of assumed. The way certainty no longer moved unchallenged. Nothing had been reclaimed yet, but something had changed. The momentum that once moved in only one direction had stalled, and when momentum stalls, balance becomes possible. Not immediately, not cleanly, but inevitably. Because once cracks appear, they don't heal on their own. They widen, quietly, until something gives. Once the cracks were visible, the work became precise. Not hurried, not emotional. Precise. Because this wasn't about catching someone in the moment. It was about understanding how everything fit together and where it could no longer hold. You didn't rush to act. You organized. Not on paper, not digitally. In your mind. You began separating what was assumed from what was documented. What was said casually from what had actually been authorized. What depended on trust from what depended on process. And slowly, the shape of the situation emerged, not as a single betrayal, but as a system that had grown comfortable operating without resistance. Nothing was challenged directly. That was important. Challenges invite defense. Defense invites justification. And justification delays exposure. Instead, you allowed the system to continue exactly as it was, because systems reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they're stable. Because when people think nothing is changing, they stop hiding what matters. You began noticing patterns that could no longer be explained away. Noticing who spoke with authority and who merely repeated it. Who initiated decisions and who simply enforced them. The difference mattered, because authority and execution leave different traces. You also noticed timing. When decisions were made, when they were communicated, and who benefited most from the delay between the two. Each gap told a story. Each shortcut left a mark, and those marks began to connect. At the same time, you made no effort to correct false assumptions about your awareness. If someone believed you didn't notice, you let them believe it. If someone assumed you no longer understood, you didn't interrupt. Misjudgment, you realized, was now working in your favor. This wasn't manipulation. It was allowance. Because people who underestimate you often finish your work for you. Information began arriving without effort. Explanations volunteered. Justifications offered preemptively. Confidence breeds generosity, not kindness, but carelessness. And carelessness creates records, contradictions, and witnesses. You noticed how often decisions were explained differently depending on the audience. How details shifted slightly to suit the listener. How responsibility blurred when questions became too specific. None of it required confrontation. It only required memory. You began mentally indexing moments. Who said what? When? In whose presence? Not to trap anyone, but to understand how the narrative adapted under pressure. And adaptation, repeated often enough, becomes evidence. Because the truth doesn't need to be forced. It only needs to be allowed to finish forming. There was a shift now in how people behaved around you. Not suspicion, but awareness of uncertainty. The casual confidence from before had thinned. Explanations were longer. Smiles more deliberate. The effort to appear calm had increased. And effort always leaves residue. Mistakes became more frequent. Not dramatic ones, procedural ones. Small lapses in coordination. A step taken before alignment. A decision referenced before it was supposed to be known. And once again, you did nothing. You allowed momentum to continue uninterrupted. Because momentum, unchecked, always exposes its weakest point. You also prepared yourself internally for what would come next. Not emotionally, structurally. You accepted that once the setup completed itself, there would be no clean return to before. That clarity brings consequence. That consequence brings reaction. And reaction, once triggered, cannot be controlled. And at some point, a quiet understanding settled in. All it would take now was a single question asked by the wrong person. Because when preparation reaches this point, timing becomes the only variable left. The final stage of the setup wasn't about gathering more. It was about stopping. Stopping the urge to intervene. Stopping the temptation to correct. Stopping the instinct to soften what was coming. Because softening would only delay what had already become structurally unavoidable. Everything that needed to surface was already in motion. Not because you pushed it, but because it had been allowed to run without resistance for too long. You could feel it now. The tension wasn't inside you anymore. It had shifted outward. Conversations carried weight. Decisions hesitated mid-sentence. The ease that once powered everything had been replaced by caution, and caution slows systems down. Nothing had been exposed yet, but everything that would be exposed was already set. And that was the moment you understood something final. This was no longer about whether justice would arrive. Only when. Because once a system begins collapsing under its own imbalance, no one needs to knock it down. They only need to stop holding it up, and gravity will do the rest. The truth didn't arrive with an announcement. It didn't demand attention. It moved the way truth usually does when it's been waiting, quietly, through channels no one thought to guard anymore. It started with a question, not yours, not confrontational, just a routine inquiry, asked at the wrong moment by someone who didn't realize they were stepping into something unfinished. A detail that didn't quite align. A pause where an answer should have been immediate. And in that pause, the first thread loosened. No one panicked. Not yet. But something changed in the air. Voices lowered. Explanations lengthened. The confidence that once carried decisions forward without friction hesitated, just enough to be noticed. That hesitation mattered. Because when answers slow down, attention speeds up. You didn't intervene. You didn't correct. You didn't guide the moment. You allowed the question to stand, unanswered for a beat longer than comfort allowed. And in that space, others began to listen differently. Not as participants, but as observers. The second question came later. Different person, different context, same subject. This time, the answer contradicted the first, not dramatically, but subtly. A date shifted. A responsibility softened. A justification reframed. No one called it out. They didn't need to. The inconsistency had already landed. That's how truth moves when it's no longer contained. It doesn't rush. It repeats. Because once two versions exist, neither of them feels safe anymore. Tone shifted quickly after that. Reassurance returned, not directed at you, but outward. Explanations offered before questions were asked. Clarifications delivered preemptively, as if anticipating scrutiny. The effort to stay ahead of concern had begun. An effort creates visibility. More people were now aware that something needed explaining. Not because they suspected wrongdoing, but because imbalance had become noticeable. Conversations widened. Decisions were mentioned in passing to people who previously didn't need to know. Language softened further, as if careful phrasing could realign something that had already slipped. But language can't stabilize a system once it starts contradicting itself. Because the moment truth leaves the room, it starts finding witnesses. Containment began to fail quietly, not through confrontation, but through diffusion. Pieces of information traveled independently now, each one incomplete, but together forming a shape that was becoming harder to ignore. Someone remembered something they hadn't questioned before. Someone else noticed a timeline didn't match what they'd been told. Another deferred approval publicly, saying they needed to double-check first. A meeting was postponed, not canceled, just delayed, until clarification could be provided. Small things, human things. And once review began, it stopped belonging to the people who had started it. Stacking followed. And stacking creates pressure. You could feel the behavioral shift immediately. Fewer assumptions. More verification. Decisions that once moved forward confidently were now paused. Not rejected, but examined. An examination, once started, rarely stays narrow. Certainty thinned. Language changed. As far as I know. I believe. I'll have to confirm. Confidence had given way to caution, and caution slows everything down. Because once momentum reverses, even small truths start moving things backward. You remain where you were. Calm, observant, uninvolved in appearance. And that mattered more now than ever. Because involvement invites attribution, and attribution gives others somewhere to redirect responsibility. By staying still, you allowed the truth to belong to itself. At this stage, it no longer needed protection. It was being carried forward by process. You could see consequences beginning to form, not emotionally, but procedurally. Requests for documentation. References to earlier discussions. The quiet resurfacing of details that had once been smoothed over. What had felt settled was now open, not aggressively, but inevitably. This wasn't exposure yet, but it was movement. And movement changes outcomes. The system that once relied on silence now had to account for explanation. An explanation, repeated often enough, reveals exactly what silence was hiding. By the end of it, one thing was clear. Whatever came next would not be decided by who spoke the loudest or who appeared the calmest. It would be decided by what could be verified. And verification has no patience for convenience, no loyalty to intention, only alignment with fact. The truth had begun to move. And once it does, it doesn't ask permission to keep going. And it doesn't stop where anyone expects. Justice did not arrive with confrontation. It did not announce itself, and it did not ask to be witnessed. It arrived the way justice often does when truth has already done its work, quietly, through systems that no longer needed persuasion. The first indication was subtle. A decision paused without explanation. An approval returned with conditions where none had existed before. A matter redirected for further review. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional. But those pauses carried meaning. They signaled that authority was no longer moving freely in one direction. People who had once spoken with confidence began choosing their words more carefully. Explanations were reviewed before being offered. Statements softened. Certainty thinned. Not because anyone had demanded it, but because the environment itself had changed. Power had begun to redistribute. When reviews followed, they did not feel accusatory. They felt procedural, methodical, each one independent, each one unavoidable. Documents aligned themselves naturally. Timelines corrected without argument. Statements, once comfortable standing alone, now had to sit beside records that didn't bend. No accusation was required. No defense was invited. The truth no longer needed advocates. What you noticed most was the shift in posture. Meetings shortened. Decisions deferred upward. Responsibility passed more carefully from one set of hands to another. Those who had once acted decisively now asked for confirmation, not from you, but from the process itself. And process does not negotiate. At some point, reversals began, quietly. A responsibility narrowed. An authority reassigned. A role adjusted temporarily. The language remained polite, professional, measured, but the effect was unmistakable. Control was returning to where it had always belonged. Not all at once, not loudly, but definitively. There was no apology offered. None was needed. Apologies belonged to emotion. This was not emotional. This was correction. You felt the change in small, ordinary ways. Access restored without announcement. Decisions routed back through you without ceremony. Questions asked again, not as courtesy, but as necessity. Your voice wasn't elevated. It was normalized. And that normalization mattered more than any vindication could have. What surprised you wasn't what others lost. It was what quietly returned to you. The right to decide without justification. The right to be consulted before action. The right to say no without explanation. Dignity came back not as an apology, but as an assumption, and that was enough. There was no triumph here. No satisfaction taken from watching others recalibrate. Their discomfort was not the point. Peace was. Peace does not need witnesses. The environment shifted again, subtly, but completely. Conversations regained balance. Decisions regained structure. Where reassurance had once been necessary, clarity now stood on its own. Where management had replaced respect, respect quietly returned. And respect, once restored, changes everything. What settled in was not a sense of victory, but of alignment. Nothing had been taken by force. Nothing had been demanded. What was out of place had simply been returned to where it belonged. You didn't explain yourself afterward. You didn't recount what had happened. You didn't seek acknowledgement. Those things belong to people who still need their truth validated. You didn't, because the outcome spoke clearly enough. What remained was calm, a steadiness that came not from endurance, but from closure. The understanding that silence had not been weakness, it had been patience. That restraint had not been surrender, it had been strategy. And that justice, when allowed to work without interference, does not rush, but it does not miss. The most important lesson was not about betrayal. It was about dignity. That dignity does not need to be defended loudly. That respect does not need to be demanded. And that when boundaries are restored quietly, they hold more firmly than those rebuilt in anger. The story did not end with confrontation. It ended with balance. And balance, once regained, does not ask to be tested again. It stays.